Thank you all for coming. Good evening. I met Sunil. I got to know Sunil through my sister, so I have to thank her for introducing us. Sunil, as you know, is a professor of Persian and Indian Literatures at LPU, at Boston University. And he's been in Pune for a month to take a course and spend a kind of a retreat at Flame University, just outside Pune. So he's graciously agreed to come and share his work with us, and is reading from his new book and his work on Mughal and Persian art. Thanks, Sunil, for coming.
Thank you all for coming, and it's wonderful to be in this beautiful space. But I hope you don't fall asleep while I talk. But I think at least the pictures will keep you mesmerized, if not what I have to say. This is part of a book that is coming out later this year on basically Persian poetry at the Mughal court, and really the kind of the Iranian presence in the early Mughal period. It's a social and literary history of the early Mughal court. This is just one part of it, because Kashmir became very prominent for the Imperial family. I'll begin with these words from a poem, English poem that some of you may know. Who has not heard of the Vale of Kashmir, with its roses the brightest that earth ever gave, its temples and grottos and fountains as clear as the love-lighted eyes that hang over their wave? If you've guessed, points, plus points for you. These verses are from Lala Rukh, a romance composed in 1817 by the Irish poet Thomas Moore. I think it's sort of gotten mixed up here. I had a picture of that. Anyway, these verses written in 1817 are celebrating Kashmir as a paradise and a garden. It really makes you think, how did this come about in English poetry? What is the history of Kashmir as a garden and paradise? We see this image everywhere today, especially in the 70s film songs. 70s, 80s, they were set in Kashmir, and those images of paradise then came to be mixed with sort of a paradise lost of violence in Kashmir. And so you have these really two opposite images juxtaposed. And what I do is really trace a history of these kind of images and go back to the Mughal period. Kashmir actually has a long history in Persian poetry of, both in Iran and India, as a frequent image of a beautiful place, and especially the celebration of the people as beautiful. And interestingly, in the very early Persian poetry from the 11th, 12th centuries, this image is always juxtaposed with references to Babylon, which was imagined as the home of magic and magicians, and Kashmir as the land of beautiful people. So these two kind of images always went together. But even before, in English poetry, as I said, the Mughals had this kind of idea of Kashmir as paradise and a garden. And we can actually go even earlier than that. In Sanskrit and Buddhist texts, there was a really elaborate kind of, cosmology of the land of Kashmir as the kind of sacred land and close to paradise. And that's not really my field of expertise and research, but other people have done research on that to show how that idea developed in really older Persian, in older Sanskrit and texts. And that really kind of fed into the Mughal period. And so the Mughals, when they started taking an interest in Kashmir, they borrowed a lot of sort of things that were already around, older traditions, histories, poetries, writing about Kashmir. And one of the Sanskrit scholar, actually, Ronald Inden, who studied these the pre-Mughal texts, he proposes that there are two concurrent practices at play here. One is of imagining Kashmir as a paradise, and the second of making it into one. So you can kind of, imagine it as that and write about it in poetry, but then how do you actually actualize that kind of, that image? And this is what the Mughals, I think, did so well. So what I want to do today is really focus, as I said, on the Mughal period and tell you a little bit about how Kashmir came to be a central place in the court for actually not the whole Mughal period, but really from the end of Akbar's reign till the early Aurangzeb reign, but especially for Jahangir and Shah Jahan, Kashmir was very important. It was one of the the important provinces of the empire, but also a retreat for the imperial family. So a lot of summers were spent there. And especially we'll see that Shah Jahan's children, Dara Shikoh and Princess Jahanara, they were very engaged with the Sufis of the valley, so that they had a relationship with the land at many different levels. We are actually blessed with a wonderful archive, to study this period. We have lots of histories in Persian, which some of them are translations of the old Kashmiri histories. We have a lot of poetry, but most of the Persian material especially the poetic material, has not been studied so far. So this is kind of, I found as I got more and more into it and kept discovering manuscripts that that nobody's really talked about these texts, probably because it was felt that they were a bit repetitive, that they keep talking about, how many poems or texts can you read about Kashmir is beautiful and it's a garden, but unless you study those texts seriously, then you realize that each subsequent text is doing something very new and taking that kind of the aesthetics further and further. We also have a number of paintings, and by paintings I mean really miniatures, what we call, although art historians don't like to call them miniatures, so we call them book paintings, paintings in manuscripts, and that's what I'm going to show you here, and as well as accounts of European travelers. So this is also a really wonderful way to kind of put the Persian accounts, whether in prose or poetry, next to European accounts in French or English mainly, and especially we'll see one of the most kind of a prominent French writer of the 17th century, François Bernier, who visited Kashmir with Aurangzeb, and he had a lot to say about that. And it's also, I think, of interest that we have this view of the Mughals as kind of very decadent too and opulent, that they just kind of sat around, and some of them at least, if they're not opulent, then they are kind of the other extreme, like Aurangzeb. But here we get a very different picture of the Mughals. That yes, there is, as the poetry and the painting show, that there was a lot of kind of appreciation of material beauty, so carpets and objects and things like that, especially the gorgeous gardens of Kashmir. But there's also a genuine kind of attachment and affection for the place, and we see this. It comes out in the poetry of a certain kind of a group of poets of this period. That's where I slipped, because where was Lala Rookh, the Irish poem? So there it is. That was what I started the verses with, the famous poem that made Kashmir household word in English-speaking sort of societies.
Can you just repeat that poem?
Sure. Yes, slowly. Here, let me go back so you have that. Who has not heard of the Vale of Kashmir, with its roses the brightest that earth ever gave, its temples and grottos and fountains as clear as the love-lighted eyes that hang over their wave. And then I wanted to just show you, of course, you know where Kashmir is, but we really, when we talk about Kashmir, it's the Kashmir Valley, not the whole kingdom or any of the adjacent regions, you know, very small kind of part of it. And this is, you know, the paradise metaphor is still around with us. This was a recent kind of an ad. And yet we also have, of course, you know, as I said, this image of violence. So with the one of paradise, you know, here and the violence, so they're juxtaposed together. And then this is a picture I'm going to come back to at the very end. This is a Mughal or a late Mughal painting by this artist Mir Kalan Khan, done in Lucknow, about village life in Kashmir. And you can see it has a lot of European influence, but just the way that kind of Kashmir is depicted, you know, the landscape, the kind of very harmonious, and that's where I get the idea of, for the metaphor, Arcadia, and the people, sort of simple, kind of dignified people going about their work, you know, so this romantic idea of Kashmir towards the end of the Mughal period. We'll get back to that and see how does that come about. Okay, now we can go. So the earliest Mughal account of Kashmir is by a person named Mirza Dughlaq, who was a kinsman, a cousin of Babur, the Emperor Babur, and who ruled the valley on behalf of Humayun in the 1540s. Almost half a century before Mughal armies actually conquered the valley. They only actually took the valley in the 1580s in Akbar's period. But already they had started writing about Kashmir early on. In his history that was written in Persian, Mirza Dughlaq praises the natural landscape of Kashmir in these words. He says, "The greenery of the fields with their flowers and trees withers the preeminence of paradise and the garden of Iram," which is a garden of paradise. So from the very first kind of, you know, Mughal Persian text about Kashmir, this comparison to paradise is being made. And over time, this would be kind of repeated so much that it became a cliche. As I said, the Mughals then finally took Kashmir, you know, from the Chaks in 1586 in a very quick military operation, and it became a province, important province, Suba, of the Mughal Empire. So here you see that, you know, it's relatively a small province of the Mughal Empire, but, you know, it's a very prominent part of it. Akbar visited the valley only once, but fortunately we have his court historian Abul Fazl. You all know him. He wrote about Kashmir in his encyclopedic work Ain-e-Akbari. And I'm just going to read from a few lines from Abul Fazl's description of Kashmir in translation that's done by Wheeler Thaxton. The country is enchanting and might be fittingly called a garden of perpetual spring, surrounding a citadel terraced to the skies, and deservedly appropriate to be either the delight of the worldling or the abode of the dervish. Its streams are sweet to the taste, its waterfalls music to the ear, and its climate is invigorating. The rain and snowfall are similar to that of Turkestan and Persia. The enchanting flowers fill the heart with delight. Violets, the red rose, and wild narcissus cover the plains. To enumerate its flora would be impossible. Its spring and autumn are extremely handful, extremely beautiful. And what is noteworthy here, that this part where he says that its climate and its kind of topography is similar to that of Iran and the Mughal homeland, Turkestan. So that we see this idea then in the subsequent kind of century that Kashmir comes to be sort of to be a little Iran, a little Persian garden that reminds the Mughals of kind of the world they've left behind, but also a new kind of Persian garden, an Indo-Persian garden. But this comparison will kind of you know, persist for a long time. And a thriving Persian, culture had already existed in Kashmir. So actually, the Mughals didn't bring in Persian. Persian had literature and poetry, etc., had existed in South Asia and India, for almost half a sort of millennium before the Mughals came. But this really marked a new phase in the history of Persian literature, and with Kashmir at the center of it. The fourth Mughal, Akbar son Jahangir, visited Kashmir frequently. He actually went there many times as a prince, but even as a ruler, he visited Kashmir on 7 occasions. And he passed away on the 7th trip, his last trip, as many of you may know, in 1627, when he was coming back from a visit to Kashmir. That's when he died, and then his body was brought to Lahore and buried there. On an earlier trip to the province in the spring of 1621, he lovingly describes his impressions of the land in his memoirs. And, you also, are doubtless aware that Jahangir's memoirs are a very important kind of archive for the history of the period, but just kind of a wonderful account and autobiography that, of a person, very kind of with intimate details. So Jahangir says, and again in Thaxton's translation, Kashmir is a perennial garden and an ironclad bastion. And again, this idea of garden, but it's also sort of very a remote sort of place like a Shangri-La, that it's difficult to get there. For monarchs, it is a garden that delights the eye, and for poor people, it is an enjoyable place of retreat. Its lovely meadows and beautiful waterfalls are beyond description. Its flowing waters and springs are beyond number. As far as the eye can see, there is greenery and running water. There are fields after fields of all kinds of flowers, and the varieties of herbs are too many to count. During the enchanting spring, mountain and plain are filled with all sorts of blossoms, gateways, walls, courtyards, and roofs of houses come ablaze with tulips. And if you've been there, you realize that this is really true. This poetic outburst felicitously combines a realistic, so it's quite actually in some ways a realistic description, but romanticized in his poetic sort of Persian that he uses, and using a mixture of kind of a conventional garden imagery that we find in classical Persian poetry, and this is what I would say a precursor to a fad that kind of would take hold in the later Jahangir and Shah Jahan period. The thrill of traveling in Kashmir is communicated in this painting that would seem to have been made for an album in Jahangir's time. And here you see Jahangir in this boat with many of his courtiers, and this would be what appears, as it says here, Lake Wular, that's on the northwest of Srinagar, and with an island in the middle of the lake and some architectural structures. So we were able to identify, and you can see little details of kind of flowers on the lake. This was a hunting party, because there are some people with falcons here we see. I think that's, my eyesight is not failing. Yeah, okay, good. Right. And I think more than one, right? Yeah. And an excursion to this lake is described in Jahangir's memoir. So you can actually match his description of going on this lake in his the Tuzuke Jahangir, or his autobiography. And he mentions the man-made island with buildings in the middle of the lake, the Zain Lanka, that was constructed by the pre-Mughal ruler, Sultan Zainul Abidin, who was really kind of one of the most beloved rulers of Kashmir. And the looming gray mountains in the background indicate that the landscape is definitely Kashmir. And we see this sort of as a sign of kind of it marks when Mughal painters are representing Kashmir, you'll always see mountains like that in the background. Some scholars have argued that it was Jahangir's wife, of Persian origin, Nur Jahan. And here we have two very different pictures of her, who deserves the credit of making Kashmir a favorite destination where the imperial court regularly traveled in the summers in the 17th century. And I don't know if you've seen, I just find this portrait of Nur Jahan interesting, where she's dressed as a man and hunting. Usually we see her more in this kind of feminine mode as a lot of Mughal women, but this one is in this painting in the Rampur Library, and it's almost certainly Nur Jahan. And it's, I think, it's mentioned that she was sort of a manly woman. So going to Kashmir was a larger phenomenon of life in the peripatetic harem of the time. So the harem was always on the move at this time, right from the early Mughals. Especially the early ones, they were kind of, living in tent cities and going from place to place, whether on campaigns or on hunting trips, or on vacation to Kashmir. And when we read descriptions of how many people would go on these annual trips with the court, Mughal court, it's astounding, And this also, scholars have said that this, as women, sort of began to take more of an active role in Mughal politics, especially the princesses of, this time, Jahanara and Zebu-Nisa, etc., that there were lots of caravansarais made on the way too, so that they could stop, the court could stop on the way, on the road to Kashmir. The road that, the route to Kashmir was called the Mughal or Imperial Road, was one of three common routes from the Indian plains through two main passes in the formidable Pir Panjal mountain range that led to the valley. And it became a well-trodden road in the 17th century. This road, I don't know if you've followed news about this, is back in the news these days. Right, so that this is one of the routes, the Mughal routes, so that this one goes through Nowshera. This was the more traditional, Rajouri, and into the valley, and an 84-kilometer stretch of this road is being developed today to link the districts of Poonch and Rajouri more easily to Srinagar. And since 2010, this is the site of the Mughal road car rally that you see in this ad here. I've never actually participated in this, but it's one of my kind of dreams, ever since I've been studying this part of the world, to travel on the road. I've only taken flights to Srinagar, but to travel on the road, and I know people who've done it actually, and kind of try to experience what the Mughals did, and it's possible. Those caravansarais still exist. So, as I had mentioned, Nur Jahan, she was especially active in helping to develop the handicrafts industry and created a vogue for Kashmiri embroidery and shawls and actually perfumes that never faded. So, just again, the whole European sort of, fascination for Kashmiri shawls goes back to Nur Jahan's personal interest in the handicrafts of the valley. Several pavilions and gardens were built in and around Srinagar by her and other members of the extended imperial family, such as the gardens of Achabal, Verinag, Nishat Bagh, which is right in Srinagar, you may have seen, and the most magnificent of all the terraced gardens, Shalimar Bagh. This we all have heard about, even if you have not seen. It truly is the jewel of Mughal gardens. Jahangir had a poet laureate, Malikushuara, or the sort of the court poet, who was an Iranian emigre from Safavid regions. His name was Talib Amuli, and he accompanied the emperor to Kashmir on several of his trips, composing verse travelogues of the arduous and rewarding journey to the valley. And in his poems, he wrote actually two poems in Persian. He describes the natural wonders of the place. One of the poems opens with the title, with the line, "Traversing the difficult way to Kashmir has become easy by the fortune of the Emperor Jahangir." So that just Jahangir's kind of rule is so blessed that it has made even this difficult trip and travel to Kashmir kind of an easy thing. He goes on in his poem to boast that Jahangir has eased the difficulties of traveling, a road that is, to quote, more delicate than the arrow-like eyelashes of the beloved. So the narrow road to Kashmir, and on which he says the traveler clings as a feather to an arrow. So you may know that Persian poetry is a lot about these kind of very, almost sometimes outlandish metaphors and really fine imagery. And this was just a way for court poets to write about these, the journey and arriving there in many different ways. So then after describing the difficult path in a dozen or so different ways, the poet concludes that the mountainous region is a garden made by God and renewed by the architect, Spring. So that the spring season is really what creates Kashmir. It's the architect of the valley, and God is its creator. At the end of the long road lies the garden of Kashmir with its many streams and variety of flowers and fruit trees, peopled with nightingales, the bulbuls of, again, poetry, and ring doves singing melodiously. The picturesque quality of the place overwhelms the viewer, and one's vision, the nazar, cannot get enough of the sight. This is, again, what Talib is saying in his poem, that the vision of Kashmir is just too much when you arrive in the valley. And then he says that his poetic talents are insufficient to describe this divine garden, and he has reached the limits of speech. This is, of course, a poetic kind of, rhetorical trope that you say, well, I can't say any more because words fail me at this point. But after having set the appropriate scene, typical for a Persian courtly poem, he gets to the real purpose, which is to really praise Jahangir and his rule. So a lot of court poetry was really about praising the rulers, and you used a lot, different devices, descriptions of places, descriptions of their victories in battles, etc., and then lead to kind of this panegyric or the praise section of the poem. Along with his poets, Jahangir was also accompanied by his favorite artists during his visits to Kashmir. The talents of the master painter Ustad Mansoor, one of his main artists, who was given the title Nadir al-Asr, the rarity of the age, he was a unique person of the age, was specially called in to record the distinctive flora and fauna of the valley. Jahangir records various instances of having Mansoor capture the likeness of a particular bird or a flower in his memoirs. For instance, he says, one spring day in Sukhnag, while drinking by a waterfall, he spotted a starling, a bird. He noted down a detailed description of it and then had Mansoor paint its likeness. And we have Mansoor's painting, which is amazing that this bird is described in Jahangir's memoirs, and then this is the painting he told his artist to paint. All in all, Jahangir had Mansoor produced 100 paintings of flowers in Kashmir. One of these is the well-known image of the red tulip. This you may have seen. This is which, in the words of the art historian Ashok Das, is a rare survivor amongst the flower studies made by Ustad Mansoor. So this is for art historians and for studies of flora, in the Mughal period. This is a very important painting. As I said, in the spring of his last year, Jahangir had gone to Kashmir to recuperate from an illness, but a few months later, at age 58, on October 28th, he breathed his last in Rajouri, one of the stops on the Mughal road, and his body was eventually brought to Lahore and buried in a garden owned by Nur Jahan on the banks of the Ravi River. Jahangir's son and successor, Shah Jahan, was not as attached to Kashmir as his father. So the Mughal emperor who was the most attached was Jahangir, and as I said, it was probably because of Nur Jahan. His favorite place, Shah Jahan's favorite place, was not surprisingly Agra, and then his new capital, Shah Jahanabad, Delhi. He was really more of a city person, I would argue. Nevertheless, he continued the ritual of visiting Kashmir in the summers and made 4 trips to the valley during his 30-year reign, so not as many as his father. The first of these took place in the summer of 1634, 3 years after the death of his beloved wife, Arjuman Banu Begum, better known as Mumtaz Mahal. Kashmir was the ideal change of scene for the grieving emperor. Most courtly representations of Shah Jahan show him in a formal setting, and you may have seen him holding court in the in Diwan-e Khas or Diwan-e Aam in the Red Fort or one of those. But in this painting, he sits on a terrace by the Dal Lake, in Srinagar, and he's with water lilies and mountains in the background. So again, we see those gray mountains, and then those are flowers on the lake and the boats. So this setting is definitely Kashmir, and I would conjecture that the reason that he and all the courtiers are dressed in white is because they're still mourning Mumtaz Mahal. During Shah Jahan's reign, in addition to maintaining its status as an imperial resort, Kashmir also became a spiritual center and a poet's colony. As I had mentioned in the beginning, Shah Jahan's 2 eldest children, Princess Jahanara and Prince Darashikoh, were followers of a Sufi master whose name was Mullah Shah or Mullah Akhund Shah, who had arrived from Badakhshan in Central Asia and made Srinagar his home. And here we have this is a painting, because it's a rarely seen painting in Tehran. We don't have a color picture of it, but this is thought to be Princess Jahanara visiting Mullah Shah in Kashmir. And this is the Mullah Shah Mosque, which is not in use. A really beautiful building that was commissioned. Jahanara and her brother, they paid for this personally for Mullah Shah. And so it became a important Sufi center. There are several places in Srinagar that are connected to Sufis. And as for being a poet's colony, since Kashmir had always been kind of this place that was glorified and praised for its beauty in classical Persian poetry, for its elegant cypresses and lovely inhabitants, the poets at Shah Jahan's court, who at this time were mostly of Iranian origin. So his court poets, Persian court poets, he had Hindi, Sanskrit poets as well, but his Persian court poets at this time were mostly Iranian emigres, because Indians had just started to learn Persian, whether Indian Muslims or Hindus, and were entering the kind of administrative service and becoming poets in their own right. So it was a scene dominated by Iranians, and they found Kashmir an ideal place to sojourn. It was much pleasant for some of them than being in the hot plains. Although sometimes, when there's this kind of overemphasis on Kashmir being this Persian garden and Iranians loving it, Iran is not a garden really. It's pretty much a hot place, and and if you've been there, I know some people have here, and it's a desert. So what they're imagining it to be a garden is also something that they idealize in poetry. And the very few places in Iran actually are like Kashmir. In fact, almost none. The northern region around the Caspian Sea is very green and lush, but it's more like a humid jungle than this kind of what Bernier says Kashmir as the kind of the topography and climate of Europe. So these people the poets made the valley kind of their kind of retreat, a poet's colony, and to the point that Kashmir came to be called Little Iran. The phrase is Iran is Saghir. Because of all its associations with Persia, but also because of the number of Persians living there at this time. All the major poets of Shah Jahan's court spent long periods of time there. In fact, one of his poets, called Salim Tehrani, declared in a verse, he says, "Find a corner of Kashmir to live in, enough of the going back and forth from Agra and Lahore." So, in fact, many poets of Shah Jahan's court did that, and they would retire once they finished their service at court. They would retire to Kashmir, and several major poets are buried in Srinagar in a place called the Mazar-e-Shuara, the tomb of poets. And the poets are Shah Jahan's poet laureate, Kaleem, Kashani, Qudsi, Mashhadi, Salim Tehrani, whom I just mentioned. They're all buried in this Mazar-e-Shuara, which was a romantic spot, the Dal Lake in Srinagar. And if you're interested, there's a, I thought, let's see. Yeah, so this was another one of the Sufi I skipped. Has anybody been to Pari Mahal? It's really amazing, the place. It's above the hills of Srinagar and the Zabarwan hills, and you have this amazing view of Srinagar. And it was thought to be a retreat for Sufis and a library perhaps for Mullah Shah. This is kind of Darashiko here with Sufis of Kashmir. So he, as I said, he and his sisters were very close to and patrons of Sufis. And then this is the Wikipedia entry on Mazar-e-Shuara. But I have to say, when I went there for my research a few years ago, and with a local friend, we tried to find it. We could not. Srinagar has kind of grown, so there's something. But there are pictures. Intact Kashmir also has. I found after very recently actually that they have taken a number of pictures, and that if you do make an effort, they say you can find it. But I was unable to in the time I was there. So the heyday of Mughal culture in Kashmir was really in the 1630s and 40s. This is the time when these poets are there, Darashiko and Jahanara are there. And this was facilitated to a great degree by the patronage of one of the governors of Kashmir in this decade, in the 30s and early 40s, a man called Ehsanullah Zafar Khan, really quite unknown. And he was a poet and also of Iranian origin. His poetic takhallus, his pen name was Ehsan, and we have a lot of his poetry that survives as well. And here I've called pictures, portraits of him from various paintings, and that in various he appears. And some of these you'll see a little later, the full painting where he shows up. But this was the man, and I refer to him as Zafar Khan. This was his father before him, Khwaja Abul Hasan, had also been the governor of first Kabul province and then Kashmir. Usually they were connected. So he inherited this position, and they were really kind of, they had been officials in the Iranian Empire, in the Safavid Empire. But like many Iranians of that time, they came to India and found employment at the Mughal court. He was also related to the, by marriage into the imperial family. He married a woman, a person named Buzurg Khanum, who was the niece of the Empress Mumtaz Mahal, her sister's daughter. And with this imperial connection, he became a member of the most elite circle at court that kind of dominated the cultural life at this time. Zafar Khan was a generous friend of poets, and in the entire period of Mughal history was perhaps only matched by the poet general whom you know, Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan, right, from Rahim, or the poet, Hindi and Persian poet, and Khan Khanan's tomb in Delhi. We know him much better, but Zafar Khan was equally an important patron and governor of the time. When a Sahib, a famous poet from Iran who visited India for 6 years in this time, he actually went back. He was in Zafar Khan's company, to whom he dedicated several affectionate poems. At this time, when Zafar Khan was the governor of Kashmir, he really made writing poems on Kashmir kind of a pastime for poets, and this is what I'm going to get into now. And this poet Sahib, who comes from Kashmir, he compares Zafar Khan and Rahim Khan Khanan, and says, I wonder who is the better patron, and it must be Zafar Khan. for him, it's of course there are other poets. If they got money from Rahim, they would say Rahim was the better patron. It was really, there was it was a patronage system, so it was very much also poets wrote what their patrons wanted to hear. And what is really amazing too is that this fad about writing about Kashmir in the 1630s and 40s that takes place. We even have a Sanskrit text about Kashmir by a poet named Pandit Jagannatha. He was a famous Sanskrit poet of Shah Jahan's and a writer of Pandit of Shah Jahan's court. And only now we are starting to see with the work of scholars like Audrey Tushke and others that Sanskrit was very important at the Mughal court. And just looking at this, it's a mixture of prose and poetry, this Sanskrit work, not very long, about 3 or 4 pages, but the way the images are kind of described, the way Kashmir is kind of represented in it, it's definitely been influenced by these Persian descriptions of Kashmir. So it was sort of how these literary cultures and these texts influenced each other, that even when the Sanskrit poets would not have understood Persian or vice versa, there were ways that they were kind of communicating through some forms of translations or intermediaries of some sort. In 1644, which was his 18th regnal year, Shah Jahan visited the province of Kashmir, where he was graciously received by Zafar Khan in his garden residence. In recognition for his Zafar Khan's positive contribution to the valley, the emperor honored him by increasing his rank by 1,000 horse. The source of this information is a later 18th century historian, Shah Nawaz Khan, who says that Zafar Khan had made an autograph album with selections of poems of every poet of Shah Jahan's court, along with their portraits. Unfortunately, this book is lost because we don't know of any such thing. But what we do have is an copy of Zafar Khan's poems on Kashmir with illustrations, and that provide us these, both the text of Zafar Khan's poems and the illustrations that he had commissioned by a Mughal artist. They are really a unique example of a Mughal governor, writing about a province in this kind of way that I will kind of introduce to you, but also illustrating his kind of his life in Kashmir. This manuscript of the poems, it doesn't really have a name. We just call them the Masnaviyat of Zafar Khan. These are the narrative poems, so they're in the Masnavi form. It's a Persian form. It now is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, but belongs to the Royal Asiatic Society in London. And this manuscript somehow made its way to the, like many Mughal manuscripts, to collect, a collection in Europe sometime in the 19th century. In this work, Zafar Khan says in the introduction that he began it when Shah Jahan was in residence in the valley in his 12th year, and he continued writing poems about Kashmir. So it's a whole book about with these Masnavis. And he uses the standard kind of imagery of Kashmir that I've quoted to you, but there's also something very, as I said, unique about these poems. The manuscript contains 6 double-page miniatures. I'm going to show them to you. And the paintings were done after the text, we know, because in the end of the manuscript, several pages are left blank where there would have been more paintings, but they were never done. And the manuscript itself has a very interesting history. We know from an inscription in the manuscript that the paintings were done, this is the manuscript, the opening page, so very lavishly illustrated with this decoration, and you can see these are kind of lines of verses, and this is the inscription in the manuscript, and here we have this is one of the pages from the manuscript, a painting. This is Zafar Khan. I had showed you that individual portrait earlier, and with the poets. But here is the artist, Bishan Das, and I've kind of pulled that out from here. Bishan Das was a fairly important Mughal artist, and he was in his late years at this time. We didn't even know he would have been alive in this time, 1640s. But apparently, and it's some of you may know that it's Mughal artists frequently portray themselves in the paintings they're doing. It's a very nice kind of self-reflexive sort of act of producing the work, so that we have this artist. And I'll show you the full page later. He was the nephew of another well-known Mughal artist, Nanha, and was particularly skilled at doing manuscripts, doing portraits, as we will see later. So when we take this manuscript as a whole, it gives us a very kind of holistic picture of the court in Kashmir at this time, and with Zafar Khan really at the center. He is sort of the very kind of the good governor of this province, who's encourages the arts, etc. The first poem, I'm going to go through the three poems quickly to tell you what they're about. It's called Jalwa-e-Naz, manifestation of airs. It begins with a praise of the conventional sort of topics in Persian poetry, God, the Prophet Muhammad, and Hazrat Ali, because he was a Shia, followed by praise of Shah Jahan and his just rule. And this is where we see, so now following the paintings in the order that they appear, the first painting is found in the manuscript. And we have Zafar Khan here. This is what I showed you again, and Shah Jahan with some other courtiers before the emperor. As you can see, the scene is, we can always tell from the background, it's not Kashmir yet, and they're still probably in Agra or Lahore in a pavilion. So this is kind of setting the scene of the pre-Kashmir sort of scene, and again showing Shah Jahan holding court here. And in this first poem, Zafar Khan describes this an assembly of in Shah Jahan's court, and he says that a song and dance kind of session took place, and he was taken by the dark beauties and the enchanting atmosphere. And he says, the aged world has not seen anything like India, where merely one of its gardens is the orchard of Kashmir. So in fact, he's praising the whole Mughal empire. He says that, it's not just Kashmir, it's just one that a pleasant part of the empire. We really must look at the whole empire together. And this is kind of, then he leads up to Kashmir. And then he goes into kind of an ethnographic mode, and he describes several lists of things that are particularly associated with India, such as tropical fruits, mangoes, pineapples, sugarcane, and bananas. This is a trope that was, used as early as the time of Babur to talk about the kind of the products of a land, to celebrate its unique features. And then he describes the flowers like champa, mulsri, keura, juhi, then the birds, the parrot, the maina, the koyal, etc. So setting a very kind of a larger Indian scene before we move into Kashmir. This is very important to frame Kashmir within the context of the larger Mughal empire. The second painting after this one, a few pages later, shows sort of a very busy scene. The court is busy, is on the move. It's some people are on boats, some people are on horses. We have Zafar Khan and his brother are here on the horses, and there are also kind of, people, all sorts of people that, so what I was saying, the huge entourage that would follow the Mughal court all the way to the valley. And then, and what we know from description, the Mughal court would do, they would take the road and then at some point transfer to boats on the Jhelum, and then that was one of the ways, and then enter Srinagar on the Jhelum river where it meets Lake Dal. And then we have, we finally then in the poem, in the text, we arrive in the valley where Lake Dal with its lotuses and the various gardens are described along with the Shalimar Bagh. And this is where Zafar Khan stops and describes the details of the garden. And in the next painting, we see that Shah Jahan is resting in a garden with his son Dara Shikoh here and some of his courtiers. And here we start to see actually, very real. I mean, Mughal painting is pretty realistic, in most instances, but kind of very detailed, representations, depictions of these gardens, and this kind of this water, shoot, this and the orchard here. And actually, we don't really know which garden this is. I thought it could be the Nishat Bagh, but then as I have discussed this with other scholars, and they think it might be a structure that no longer exists, so that it's one of the gardens, but that still exists in Srinagar. And here again, where earlier when we were still in the plains, Zafar Khan had talked about the various fruits and flowers and birds of India. He does this again, but instead of kind of those tropical products, we suddenly have a very Persian kind of list. So we have, he'll give a list of fruits that are very sort of native to Kashmir, but that not to the plains, apples and quinces and things like that, and birds, etc. So that both in the paintings, in the visual kind of depictions, and the verbal, the poetic depictions, there is a distinct change in landscape. You've gone from the plains to Kashmir, and you almost feel the kind of the coolness of the place. So after we see all the grand Mughal sites, and this is a way of kind of praising Mughal rule, we arrive at Zafar Khan's own garden palace, Zafarabad, which was located on the bank of the Zadibal. That's one of the which it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But from the description of the poems, we learn that he says that in his garden palace, that there were paintings of flowers that adorned the walls. There were birds wobbling in the garden, fish sported in the pond, and he had his drinking companions around him. And in one of the lines in his poems, he says, "Our Zafarabad is no less than paradise. There is no such bounteous garden in the world." So now it's not just that, Kashmir is the paradise within the Mughal Empire, which is a great place within earth, but Zafar Khan's own, home is the garden par excellence. So we keep moving from these larger spaces into very much kind of the here and now, sort of inhabited by the poet. And the setting of the next painting in this manuscript, this is a detail of this, the garden I said, and what I thought was Nishat Bagh. I compared an old photograph of this pavilion that doesn't exist anymore to this. I thought it could be this, but it's kind of anybody's educated guess. And then, as I said, the next painting is where I had showed you earlier, where Bishan Das, the artist, is here. This is part of a double page kind of painting, a very amazing kind of a work. So this is what he might be talking about in his poem, that the walls are covered with these flowers, and we see that they're carpets, but everything kind of represents a garden. And there's a window here that actually looks out to the more natural landscape of Kashmir here. And as I said, this is Zafar Khan, and these are the court poets who are seated on this carpet here. This is a group of musicians here. You have the artist. So all sort of the people, the artists, musicians, poets, everything to do with culture, all in one assembly. And, we don't really know if this is a specific assembly or kind of, parts, different sort of a composite of different parts that was put together for this amazing painting. But this is truly one of the, unique depictions of a Mughal majlis or mehfil, a more private one. And one of, as a kind of research of, in literature, I'm not really an art historian, so I'm not going to analyze these paintings really. But what I've been trying to do is identify these poets, because they don't come with names, but I'm very interested. These are all the famous poets. So I think I've identified this is Kaleem, his court, the poet laureate who had retired and died in Kashmir. The one I said, one of the ones buried in the Mazar Ishwara there. This is another one. This one is a poet from Lahore, Munir, and so hopefully in the there'll be other clues forthcoming. And in fact, also I should mention that scholars who study ethnomusicology have also identified this as a very important painting because it shows instruments such as the nai and the ghichak, which are very Persian kind of instruments, and the daira and kanun all together. This is very sort of special to Kashmir. Now, contrast this indoor majlis with the next painting here, which is an outdoor majlis. And here we have, Zafar Khan again in a natural setting with the mountains, a stream, in a garden. And this is so that, the indoor kind of replicates the outdoor kind of garden. But they also had an appreciation for the more rugged landscape, not the more sort of the manicured gardens with the Mughal pavilions, but also natural kind of, and many, as you may know, the terrace gardens of Kashmir are built against sort of these mountain, the slopes with natural springs. There are even Nishat Bagh. And then, as all these paintings are double paintings. So this is just one side, the right side. If you look at the whole, the together too, the left side shows that this is really kind of a more fun majlis. It's not there sitting there seriously, but there's a picnic here. There's food being cooked, here. Again, you have the musicians in an outdoor setting and probably some drinking taking place, so that, depending on the weather and depending on the place, you have these kind of outdoor majlises too. And this is a very Persian tradition and goes right back to Babur. So if you read the Baburnama, you have lots of description of Babur just saying, we sat by a waterfall, it was so gorgeous, and then we drank wine and became high on, and just enjoyed listening to poetry and music. So this was the essence of kind of pleasure in the Mughal Mehfil, is that you have a garden, you have poets, friends, wine. What more do you need, right? And then what follows is, so in the rest of the poem is the last painting in the manuscript is Shah Jahan and Darashiko with courtiers in the garden, which is outside Srinagar, on the way back, the route back to the plains. So we are actually, the court is now coming back to Lahore, on the way back to Lahore, and this is one of the stops on the way. And I don't know if any of you have been here, the Verena garden, and actually it's absolutely, beautiful because of partly this octagonal architecture of the pavilion, the Mughal pavilion, that's set in this natural spring, which before the Mughals made this structure was a pilgrimage spot for Kashmiri Hindus, because wherever their springs was a Hindu, Kashmiri spring, a pilgrimage spot. And you see these little fish too in the pond. These are actually described later by European travelers, that the fish in the Verinag pond are very kind of well known, that they're distinctive. And this is also sort of an outdoor kind of majlis, because this is not a covered pavilion. It's it's open to the sky. And here I've just to juxtapose different views of the same garden. So you see, this is a modern day kind of picture. This is what it looks like. and this was a watercolor in the 19th century from the colonial period. And then the Mughal one, you can see how kind of closely it mirrors, not exactly, but enough to kind of, you know where you are in the painting, you know. And then after this, we kind of, as I said, this is the last painting in the manuscript, and the rest of the poems do not have illustrations attached to them, only the first one, which was Shah Jahan's trip and then return back to the plains. But in the rest of the manuscript, Zafar Khan describes his own life in Kashmir. And I'll just briefly tell you in the two other poems. One is called the Mekhana-e-Raz, the Tavern of Secrets. It's more mystical in tone. And here he really, what he does is he kind of bitterly critiques the ascetics who are hypocrites, the dervishes and Sufis who are hypocrites, and he says he's going to celebrate the culture of drinking wine. And after a short description again of the beauty of the Kashmiri landscape, he reflects on the change of seasons, the sadness of autumn and the harshness of winter in the valley. So there's not just all spring and beautiful gardens, but he also writes about how it's pretty kind of, the seasons change and your mood changes. And this is, in this part of the poem, he says that Kashmir is a paradise and I'm its gatekeeper. The Rizwan was the gatekeeper of the, paradise. And like the nightingale, I'm the poet of its every rose. So he really says that, I have a very personal kind of relationship and attachment to Kashmir. And then he describes the change of season again, and that it's again time to sort of, reflect on the virtues of contentment, that, that life really is as good as it gets, and you should be thankful for that. In this part, he says, I have a desire to go on pilgrimage and visit the Kaaba in Mecca. And then he talks a little bit about how he came to write these poems, so that he also reflects on his kind of role as a poet. The last poem in this collection, again without paintings, as I said, is a guide to the 7 steps back to the plains, describing really the stations of the Mughal road, which is really quite amazing too. And he takes one final tour of Srinagar and saying, let me look once again at the Shalimar Bagh, the Dal Lake, and now it's time to go back. And he describes the different station and names them. So we have a very, from a historical point of view, a record of, at what time which caravanserais were used by these courtiers going back and forth from Kashmir. So going to the colophon, the end of the manuscript, we learn from the Persian here that the work was completed basically in 1663 in Lahore by Zafar Khan. He says, the son of Abul Hassan, Zafar Khan, completed this work. This was, some years after he had given up the governorship of Kashmir and also retired from Mughal politics. In fact, his end of his career wasn't that pleasant, because he had sided with Dar Shikoh in the war of succession after Shah Jahan. So of course, when Aurangzeb came to power, anyone who the faction of Dar Shikoh, they were out of kind of favor. So he retired to Lahore. At least he wasn't sort of disposed of in any other way. And another inscription. This is a more, as you see, this is really more elaborate. At the end of the manuscript, this is a handwritten inscription, rather probably by one of the owners of the manuscript than by the calligrapher, who was Zafar Khan himself. That was his handwriting earlier in the poems. And this says that it's in the hand of Zafar Khan's son, Inayat Khan, who was one of the historians of Shah Jahan. So he wrote a history of Shah Jahan's reign, and he was the royal librarian also of Shah Jahan's time. And he says, these are the poems by my late father, in his hand, and he gives the date 1667. So that 4 years after the manuscript is completed in Zafar Khan's hand, his son is giving this inscription that this work was completed by my father. And we know that son and father passed away within a few years of each other. And another inscription by a later hand, 1679, now 12 years later, tells us that the manuscript was sold by his heirs. And so you see that these inscriptions also provide sort of a history of the book as it passed hands, but it leaves us with some questions as well. And for me, it's that this work was such a precious copy. It's the only copy with these illustrations. Why was it sold by the heirs of Zafar Khan and his after his sons died? Perhaps the family ended up poor and they had to sell the estate. But they let the manuscript pass away from the family. So from 1679 till 1834, when it enters the register of the Royal Asiatic Society in London, we don't know where it was. So, at least not yet, the adventures of this, whether it was taken by one of the Europeans early on or later or after the end of this is before the end of the Mughals, so at some point it made its way into Europe. I focused on Zafar Khan here because his poems really mark a departure from the way that Kashmir was described by almost 24 poets and historians of Shah Jahan's reign. So we have a lot of literature on Kashmir from just this period, 1630s, 40s, basically, up to the 50s a little bit. But his work is the most kind of intimate description of an attachment to this place that he governed. Some of the other poets, you feel that their work is more performative. They are writing for the emperor for a reward. There's some beautiful, verses here and there, but a lot of it is just kind of the run-of-the-mill kind of metaphors, paradise, etc. And I'm sure this is where I want to kind of leave you with is what happened to, I'm not a historian, I'm not going to give you a whole history of Kashmir in the post-Zafar Khan period, but what happened with the Mughal engagement with Kashmir, and that's the question I asked. My story in my book also ends around this time. I don't go really a lot forward than this. But apparently Aurangzeb, when he became emperor, he did visit Kashmir once. So not as many times as his father or grandfather, but once. And according to the version of events given by the French traveler Francois Bernier, it was really not because he had any love for the valley or, it was really unknown actually territory to him. And because the province was beloved by his brother Darashiko, whom he hated, it was not a place he would naturally be fond of. But his sister, Roshanara Begum, she insisted that they do the whole trip again, probably to replicate the glory days of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, that if they did this trip to Kashmir, we should do this as well. And as I said, it's here's a portrait of Aurangzeb or his name as Emperor Alamgir as a young man. You usually see him as an older man, but this is in the time when he would have gone to Kashmir in 1664-5, around that time. And the only kind of detailed description we have, so the poets are not really writing that much at this time because Aurangzeb is not really a great patron of court poetry, but we have this European traveler who had left us a detailed description of this trip to Kashmir. This is Francois Bernier in his later years in France, and him, probably that's him in a Mughal painting. And when he published his book on, it was about the Mughal Empire actually, and really about the war of succession between Shah Jahan's sons, Kashmir became a very central part of his narrative. That we see that, and this is the time also when in Bernier's early editions of his work, which were quickly translated into English in the 18th and 19th centuries, the first mapping of Kashmir takes place, so that this would then lead into the more colonial period mapping of different, especially remote parts of the subcontinent. But here we have, you see the rivers, and if you look carefully, and this is, Ladakh was known as Little Tibet at that time, and then the kingdom of Kabul on the side, but this is really Kashmir and Punjab here. So with this we enter a kind of a new phase of scientific and ethnography of Kashmir, which I argue that would not have been possible with the Mughal kind of presence and engagement with the culture of the valley, which I term as more a poetic ethnography or a visual ethnography, which leads to a more scientific ethnography. I would really, if you haven't done it, read the Kashmir section of Bernier's Travels. It's really a marvelous account of the topography, of the climate, etc., of Kashmir, but also little details of how actually difficult it was to for such a large group of people to make this journey to the valley. And he has one part where he talks about this row of elephants are going up on this narrow kind of path, and one elephant who's leading kind of this caravan stops and has a misstep and leads to 12 elephants with the harem on the howdahs on them falling into the valley, and describe what a sad scene it was that these and it caused great chaos on this trip, and that for days the elephants were calling out, they could hear them, so he had a particular kind of eye for these kinds of details about the journey and Kashmir, and I think it's reading that kind of in tandem with the Mughal Persian chronicles. I think it gives us a very rich picture, a more full picture, 2 points of view, rather than kind of just the one poetic point of view. Once Mughal rulers stopped visiting Kashmir, so that after Aurangzeb's visit, no ruler ever went to Kashmir till the end of the, till Bahadur Shah Zafar. It became kind of a romantic metaphor rather than a real place in the life of the court and the personal lives of people. And the history of the valley after this is a tragic tale peopled by a succession of cruel governors, incompetent rulers and administrators, though of course not devoid of cultural activities. It still remained Kashmir remained a center of literary and culture production of painting and manuscripts, but not patronized so much by the Mughals, but by others. Then it passed into Afghan rule in the 18th and 19th centuries, and we even have manuscripts of Pashto text that were produced in Kashmir in the 18th and 19th century. And I have one example here, the last one. No, this is actually a Chagatai Turkish text, so that we even have Turkish, the poems of Turkish texts that were being written and illustrated in Kashmir at this time. It was really a multilingual kind of a place. And this is the Pashto text with a, with a picture of the Shalimar Bagh with quite, with all its details. And here's another, not as fine as the earlier Mughal paintings, but a majlis of dancing, girls and the Afghan governor. And then just some examples of Kashmiri manuscripts. But this is, a question I've been asked, and I've asked myself, well, what about Kashmiri literature? This is not from the 19th century. This is a really remarkable manuscript of the crafts of Kashmir. And each page has a different crafts, over 100, with illustrations. And I thought here, since we are talking about manuscripts, pulp and paper making would be interesting, and with a lot of the technical vocabulary. So you see that even in Kashmir, there's kind of a more scientific, recording of culture and cultural practices, whereas the early Mughal was more a poetic response to the valley. And some of the Persian classics then started being painted in Kashmir. Kashmir and Lahore became kind of what we see today if you go to Jaipur or Delhi, the Bazari paintings that they sell for tourists. It first started in Kashmir and Lahore. They would start making these paintings. As you see, they're not as fine as the earlier paintings. And I think even a Shahnameh from Kashmir, the Persian Book of Kings, there were multiple. This was kind of like they were producing this text by the dozens for export to Iran as well, as kind of cheap editions of the Shahnameh. And at the end we come to this painting which I showed you in the beginning, the 18th century view of Kashmir. And I bring it here because, as you see, that by this time, as I said, the Mughals are not directly engaged with Kashmir, but it becomes fixed in the South Asian imagination, in the Indian imagination, as this kind of garden or this harmonious place where everything is sort of, beautiful and a paradise. And that trope has stayed with us, even when ironically in the, there have been sort of periods of violence and unrest, and even till today, but we never stop thinking of Kashmir as paradise. And the, what I've tried to do is show the kind of the Mughal contribution to that, which has largely been overlooked. The earlier, the Buddhist and Hindu texts have been studied, and the British and the later period, but not the Mughals so much. So that's my talk, and thank you for being patient. And